The smell of antiseptic was the first thing Iris noticed every Tuesday morning. Sharp and clean, and a little sad, the way certain smells carry the weight of everything that happened inside them. She was 10 years old, and she already knew that smell better than she knew the inside of her own classroom. Grandma Greta would sign them in at the front desk of Millhaven Children's Hospital, and the nurse there, a round-faced woman named Beverly who wore cartoon bear scrubs, would wave them through without asking any more. They had become regulars the way some families become regulars at a diner, except there was nothing comfortable about the ritual. Iris's mother, Nancy, had spent the last 14 months of her life on the 4th floor of this building, waiting for a kidney that never arrived. She had died on a Tuesday. Iris still wasn't sure if coming back on Tuesdays was her grandmother's way of honoring that, or if Greta simply hadn't thought to change the day. They always stopped at the chapel first to leave a small bunch of whatever flowers Greta had clipped from the yard that morning, tiger lilies in summer, dried lavender in the cold months. Then Greta would visit with the nurses she had grown fond of, and Iris would wander. She was not supposed to wander. She wandered anyway. It was the 2nd Tuesday of November when she found Emmett. He was in room 412, a corner room with a window that overlooked the hospital's small courtyard garden. The blinds were half open. Iris pressed her nose to the glass panel beside his door and looked in. The boy was 11, maybe 12, lying flat in the bed with both arms at his sides, like he was trying to take up as little space as possible. His skin had a yellowish undertone that Iris recognized without being able to name exactly why she recognized it. His eyes were open, staring straight up at the ceiling tiles, and they were the color of deep creek water, grayish-green, and they were full of a kind of tired that had nothing to do with sleep. She pushed open the door. He turned his head. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I'm Iris," she said. "Emmett." His voice was careful, like he was measuring the effort each word cost him. "Are you waiting for something?" she asked. He almost smiled. "A kidney." Iris went very still. She stepped inside the room and let the door fall shut behind her. "My mom waited for a kidney," she said. "She waited a long time." Emmett watched her cross the room and sit in the chair beside his bed, as if she belonged there. "Did she get one?" "No." He nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he already suspected about the world. They talked for 40 minutes. About the courtyard garden below, Emmett said there was a cardinal that came every morning and sat on the same branch of the same oak tree, and he had started to think of it as a visitor rather than just a bird. About school, which Emmett hadn't been to in 3 months. About Iris's mother, who had been a 3rd-grade teacher and who used to make up stories at bedtime that were different every night without ever writing them down, so that when she was gone, all those stories went with her. Emmett listened to all of it with that careful, still attention of someone who has spent months in a bed with nothing to do but learn how to truly listen to. When Iris finally left to find Greta, she walked slowly down the hallway and thought about what it would mean to give someone a piece of yourself. A living piece. She knew that was possible. She had read about it when her mother was sick, the way you could live with just one kidney and give the other away to someone who needed it. She had been 10 years old when she read that. She was still 10 years old now. She thought about it all the way home. She thought about it that night while Greta made soup on the small stove of their apartment on Birchfield Street, the steam rising in the cold kitchen air. She thought about her mother saying, once, that the bravest thing a person can do is give something away when giving costs them. "Grandma," she said, "I want to get tested, to see if I could give Emmett one of my kidneys." Greta set down the wooden spoon. She stood with her back to Iris for a long moment before she turned around. What followed was a long and gentle argument, Greta's voice never raised, never harsh, but firm in the way of someone who has already survived one enormous loss and cannot afford another. Iris was too young. Iris didn't understand the risks. There were rules, procedures, systems built for a reason. Adults made these decisions, not children. But Iris was the daughter of Nancy Beckett, and Nancy Beckett's daughter had inherited something that could not be reasoned away. It wasn't stubbornness exactly. It was more like certainty, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but simply does not move. They went to the hospital the following week, not to donate. Greta made that clear. But to speak with a doctor, to understand what the process even looked like, to give Iris a proper explanation of why this was not something a 10-year-old could simply decide. Dr. Lenore Park, the attending nephrologist, was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses she pushed up onto her forehead when she talked. She sat across from Iris with a gentleness that some doctors never quite managed to find, and she explained, carefully, the complexity of organ compatibility, of tissue typing, of cross-matching, of everything that had to align before a living donation was even considered. Iris listened, then she asked, "Can you check anyway?" Dr. Park exchanged a look with Greta, who gave a small, exhausted nod. The blood draw was quick, the weight was not. When the results came back 6 days later, Dr. Park called Greta in private first. Then she asked to speak with both of them together. She set the paper on the desk between them and said, very quietly, that she had been practicing medicine for 22 years, and she had never seen a preliminary compatibility result like this between two unrelated individuals. Iris and Emmett matched. The news spread through the hospital the way unexpected things do. Carefully at first, then faster than anyone intended. It reached the 4th floor and then, inevitably, it reached the man sitting in the private waiting room at the end of the hall. Clayton Mercer was 52 years old. He had built a real estate development company from a single failing property in his late 20s into one of the largest commercial firms in the state. He wore good suits and kept his hair short and silver, and he had the kind of face that stayed composed in difficult meetings because he had trained it to. But when Dr. Park told him there was a potential living donor, a 10-year-old girl who had walked in on her own and asked to be tested, something in that composed face broke open just slightly, the way good wood splits along a grain. He asked to meet her. Iris shook his hand the way Greta had taught her, firm and brief. She looked at him steadily. "Your son is going to be okay," she said. "I've decided." Clayton Mercer, who negotiated contracts with teams of lawyers and who had faced boards of directors in rooms where the stakes ran into the tens of millions, did not know what to say to a 10-year-old girl who spoke with that kind of quiet finality. He said, "Thank you." The ethics committee met 4 times over the following 2 weeks. There were psychologists, legal consultants, a representative from the hospital board. Greta sat through every session with her hands folded in her lap and answered every question in full. Iris sat beside her and answered every question even more fully. The committee, as a body, was not accustomed to children who understood exactly what they were agreeing to and had clearly thought about it longer and harder than most adults. The authorization was given. The surgery was scheduled. On the morning of the operation, 2 gurneys moved down the hallway toward the operating suites, Emmett in one, Iris in the other. Greta walked beside Iris with her hand wrapped around the girl's smaller one, and Clayton walked beside his son, and neither adult spoke because there were no words for what they felt in that corridor. The children spoke instead. "You scared?" Emmett asked. "A little," Iris said. "You?" "Yeah," a pause. "Iris, thank you. Like, actually, really thank you." She looked sideways at him. "Take care of it," she said, "my kidney. Treat it right." He almost laughed. It was a small sound, thin with nerves, but real. The surgeries lasted 9 hours. Clayton sat in the waiting room with Greta, and somewhere around hour 6, without quite meaning to, he told her about Emmett's mother, how she had died of a brain aneurysm 4 years ago, how Emmett had been 7, how the 2 of them had been making their way through the world with that particular, careful tenderness of people who know exactly how much they stand to lose. Greta listened, and then told him Moses about Nancy, about the classroom and the bedtime stories and the long months on the 4th floor and the Tuesday they didn't have to talk about because he already understood what she meant. Dr. Park appeared in the doorway at 8:47 in the evening. She looked tired in the specific way of surgeons after long operations, but her eyes were clear. "They're both stable," she said. "Emmett's kidney is functioning." Greta covered her face with her hands. Clayton sat very still for a moment, and then he bent forward and pressed his hands over his eyes, and his shoulders moved once, twice. The children recovered in separate rooms but video-called each other every morning, and those calls were the brightest part of both of their days. Emmett showed Iris the scar. Iris showed Emmett hers. "Kidney siblings," she announced, and Emmett said that was the best and weirdest thing anyone had ever said to him. It was during those recovery days that Clayton began to investigate. He was not someone who could sit still with gratitude. Gratitude without action felt passive in a way that made him restless. He had asked his assistant to pull everything about Iris and Greta, addresses, financial records, anything that could tell him what kind of help they needed and how he could provide it. He was not thinking about anything unusual. He was thinking about an education fund, about moving them into a better apartment, about making sure Iris never wanted for anything that money could give her. What he found instead was a medical file that stopped him cold. Nancy Beckett had been a patient at Millhaven Children's Hospital, not in the children's wing, but in the adult nephrology unit, which shared the building and the administrative system. She had been placed on the kidney transplant waiting list in the spring of 3 years ago. 8 weeks after her initial placement, a notation appeared in her file. Blood type, updated per lab correction. The notation was small, routine-looking, the kind of update that would pass through a system without anyone blinking. But Clayton had spent decades reading contracts written by people who wanted to hide things in plain sight. He knew what a small notation could carry. He called his head of corporate security, a former federal investigator named Douglas Fain, and asked him to look at the access logs from that file change. Douglas called back in 48 hours. The change had been made using the administrative credentials of Dr. Lane Farrow, Millhaven's chief of medicine, but from a terminal on a floor that Dr. Farrow had no routine reason to visit at 4:20 in the morning. And in the same billing cycle that the change occurred, a pharmaceutical consulting firm had transferred a payment of $68,000 into a private account registered to an LLC with no public officers. The LLC, after 3 more days of digging, traced back to Renwick Pharmaceuticals. Clayton stood at his office window and felt the world rearrange itself. Renwick had been running a clinical trial for an experimental dialysis compound 2 years before Nancy Beckett was diagnosed. The trial had not gone well. Several participants had developed accelerated renal deterioration, kidney damage that moved faster and further than the underlying conditions should have allowed. Nancy had been one of those participants. She had, according to records Clayton now held in his hands, retained a lawyer and begun building a case against Renwick in the months before her health declined too sharply for her to continue. By altering her blood type in the hospital system, Dr. Farrow had ensured that Nancy would never be matched to a compatible donor. The transplant she needed, the one that could have saved her life long enough to testify, would never come. Nancy Beckett had not simply fallen through the system's cracks. She had been pushed. Clayton was still processing this when his phone rang. It was his attorney, Victor Lund. "Clayton," Victor said, "we have a problem. A woman named Harriet Cole filed an emergency custody petition for Iris this morning. She's claiming the donation procedure was coerced, that you used your influence over the hospital to pressure a vulnerable child into a dangerous surgery for your own benefit." Clayton sat down slowly. "Who is Harriet Cole?" he asked. "Nancy Beckett's sister, apparently estranged. She and Nancy hadn't spoken in years. She says she wants to protect her niece." What she wanted, it became clear in the days that followed, was considerably more complicated than protection. Harriet Cole arrived at the preliminary hearing in a charcoal blazer and small diamond earrings, her expression arranged into something that read as maternal concern if you didn't look too closely. She brought a lawyer named Birch, who spoke in the careful cadences of someone accustomed to building impressions out of half-truths. They painted Clayton as a man who had used his position as a major hospital donor to expedite a procedure that should never have been approved, a child coached into sacrifice for the benefit of a billionaire's son. They produced a psychological evaluation, authored by Dr. Lane Farrow, expressing concern about Iris's attachment to the Mercer family and her impaired capacity to make decisions independent of external influence. Greta sat in the front row and kept her face still. Iris sat beside her, wearing a blue dress she had picked out herself that morning, her hands folded in her lap, watching the proceedings with those quiet, serious eyes that seemed to hold considerably more than 10 years' worth of observation. Judge Carol Ann Whitfield presided. She was known in the county for 2 things, absolute impartiality and very little patience for theater. When Clayton stood and asked permission to present evidence, she nodded. He walked the judge through everything Douglas Fane had found: the file alteration, the access logs, the consulting payment, the Renwick connection, the timeline of Nancy's case. He presented Anna Morse's sworn statement. Anna, a former administrative clerk at Millhaven, who had been the one to physically execute the file change under Dr. Farrow's instruction, and who had agreed to testify after a conversation in which Clayton told her, simply and without theater, that a woman had died, and that her daughter deserved to know why. He presented emails between Dr. Farrow and Renwick's legal team, obtained by a journalist named Fred Daly, who had been quietly investigating Renwick's trial data for months and who had received an anonymous USB drive in his mailbox the week before. The emails referred to the Beckett situation in the language of risk management. The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Whitfield looked at Harriet Cole. "Mrs. Cole, were you aware of Dr. Farrow's involvement in your sister's medical care?" Harriet's lawyer started to object. The judge raised one hand. Harriet was quiet for a long moment. Something moved across her face. Not the practiced maternal concern, but something older and more genuine and considerably more uncomfortable. "I knew Lane Farrow," she said finally, "from before. She and we had a mutual connection. Through Renwick." A pause. "I didn't know exactly what she had done. I suspected something wasn't right with Nancy's case, but I didn't look at it too closely." "And the custody petition?" "Farrow approached me. She said that with the scrutiny on the hospital, there was a risk that certain things would come out. She suggested that if Iris was removed from the current situation, it would complicate the investigation. I told myself I was doing it for the right reasons." Harriet's voice dropped. "I'm not sure I was." The custody petition was withdrawn before the judge had to rule on it. Dr. Lane Farrow was placed on administrative suspension that afternoon. The State Medical Board launched a formal investigation. Renwick Pharmaceuticals received a federal inquiry request within the week. The attorneys who had spent years protecting the company's clinical trial data suddenly found themselves in rooms where that protection no longer held. Clayton established the Nancy Beckett Foundation 6 days after the hearing. He announced it publicly, standing on the front steps of Millhaven Children's Hospital, with Emmett beside him and Greta standing a little back and to the left. He said that the foundation would work to audit transplant list procedures statewide, to fund independent oversight of clinical trials, and to provide legal resources for patients whose cases had been mishandled. He said that the name came from a woman he had never met, but whose daughter had saved his son's life. He didn't cry during the announcement. He cried afterward, in his car, with the door shut, for about 4 minutes, which was longer than he had cried at any point in the previous 4 years. That evening, he and Emmett drove across town to Birchfield Street. Greta had made pasta, Iris's favorite, and the 4 of them sat around the small kitchen table in the apartment that Clayton was already making quiet arrangements to replace with something larger and safer on a quieter street, and they ate, and they talked, and the children laughed about their matching scars and argued companionably about whether kidney siblings outranked regular siblings in any meaningful hierarchy. After dinner, while Greta and Clayton washed dishes and the children sprawled on the living room rug with a board game, Iris looked up at him from the floor. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "You can call me Clayton, sweetheart." She considered this. She looked at Emmett, who was studying the game board with great concentration and pretending not to listen. She looked back at Clayton. "I never had a dad," she said, not sad about it exactly, just stating a fact with the same directness she brought to most things. "My mom said it was just the 2 of us and that was a whole family by itself, and it was." She paused. "But Emmett keeps calling you Dad right in front of me, and it sounds really nice." The kitchen went quiet. Greta kept her eyes on the dish in her hands. Clayton dried his hands on the towel and crossed the small living room and crouched down beside Iris on the rug. Up close, her eyes were her mother's eyes. He could see that now from the photograph, Greta kept on the shelf, that same steadiness in them. "It would be the greatest honor of my life," he said, "if you wanted to call me that." Iris looked at him for a long measuring moment. Then she nodded, once, the way she nodded when she had made a decision she intended to keep. "Okay, Dad," she said. Emmett looked up from the board game. His face broke open into the widest smile Clayton had seen on him in 3 years. "Told you," he said to Iris. "Kidney siblings beats regular siblings every time. We're basically science." Iris threw a game piece at him. He caught it. And in the small, warm kitchen on Birchfield Street, while the city moved through its ordinary Tuesday evening outside the window, something that had been broken for a long time began, quietly and without ceremony, to grow back, the way certain living things do when given the right conditions, the right care, and someone willing to share what they have. The cardinal came back to the oak tree in the hospital courtyard the following morning. Emmett pointed it out to Iris on their video call, and she leaned close to her screen to look, and for a moment neither of them said anything. They just watched it together, that small red bird on its ordinary branch, living its ordinary life, showing up the way it always had. Some things are reliable that way. Some gifts you don't see coming until they've already changed everything.